Well, this is our final lesson for this Apologetics course. And tonight we're going to be looking at Christianity. Can it survive in a scientific age? And this particular chapter goes back and references several chapters that we have already studied. Now, we're not going to go back and just revisit all those things, but you can go back and look at some of those chapters, like chapter 2 and chapter 4 and several other chapters, because this chapter sort of begins to sort of tie everything up. You ever have loose ends and you just want to tie it all together? You've studied this and you've studied this and you've studied this and you've studied this. Well, this is sort of like the shoelace that ties it all together and allows us to know about our Christianity. So as we begin, there on page 63 in your study guide, here are some things that we want to try to accomplish in this particular lesson. We want to examine God's plan of creation from chaos to order. And then we want to decide if science and Christianity must always be in conflict, because that's some of the things we'd studied before from some of the scientific community. They felt like they're absolutely nothing to do with each other. Then we want to review the evidence on which our faith in God and Christ is built. We want to make sure that's on a solid rock. And then we want to be challenged to further study apologetics. Maybe you would read some of the other books that we've mentioned before. Maybe you want to find other writers who have done a lot of research. The book that we're using, Richard Kafarnis, is sort of concise. It's sort of what I look at more of a on the simplistic side. And then there's other books that really get pretty deep. And so if you're a deep thinker and you want to study more in depth, there's other references that you might want to consider looking. So as we get started, some of the questions that we may want to think about is, one, can Christianity and science coexist harmoniously? And that's a big, important question. We'll look at that here a little bit later. I want to drop down to question 3 and 4. Why did God not write creation in scientific language explaining how He created things? I mean, God spoke and things happened. Number 4, how has archaeology proved the reliability of the Bible? And we're going to look at some of that. So towards the second question there, simply says, read Genesis 1 and write down what God created each day. Then decide if God created in an orderly and logical or a haphazardly fashion. And so what I did is I decided to give you the scripture text of Genesis chapter 1. And so that handout that I gave to you, I want you to look at it, because I think that if you see what happened each day, we are going to ask ourselves, is there a progression? Is there a logical form to the way God did things? And so I want us to look at first Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And in that very first sentence, in verse 1, if you don't believe that, you're going to have a hard time from verse 2 of Genesis 1 all the way to the end of the book of Revelation. Because everything after Genesis 1:1 is what God chose to do. And so if you look at the other handout that I gave you, which I'm not going to go over, but I will make it available. This is from Answers in Genesis, and it's 3 pages long, and you can Google at Answers in Genesis and find the article on space-time, which talks about virtual particles, time, and the Trinity. That's what we find in Genesis 1, 1 and 2. And on that first page, you will see that space consists of width and length and height. And then on page 2, you will see that some of the properties of that is past, present, and future when you think about time. So you have, if you think in terms of depth, how far did God's love reach all the way down to us? How wide was it to anyone who would accept Him and believe in Him? And when you read Genesis 1, 1 and 2, you will find that it talks about the past, present, and what's continuing. And so on page 3, it talks about the properties of matter. And so you may be asking yourself the question, what does that have to do with Genesis 1 and 1:1? Well, in the beginning is time. And God created the heavens, which is space, and we read Paul's letters where he talks about going to the third heaven. And so sometimes that's confusing to people, but in a nutshell, basically where we walk and roam about here on the planet of Earth is considered the first heaven. And then the galaxies, where maybe planes would fly, or the planets or things of the stars, that would be the second heaven. But the third heaven is where God Himself reigns. And that's the way it's described. And so when you think of space, the heavens incorporates all of that. And then the earth is matter or energy. And so if you were to do a little bit of research on how the earth is matter and energy, here's one thing that it would say. It is an open system for energy, with energy radiating from the sun and being conserved in various forms of matter, such as chemical elements and compounds. Now, if you're like me and you're asking, what does that mean, chemicals and compounds? So because I like to deal in things called ammunition, think in terms of a .22 caliber bullet. And it's not very big. I probably could have brought one, but it's not very big. So if you fire a .22 caliber bullet, how fast is it going to go? Well, it depends on how much powder's in there. Whether it's a short, whether it's a long, whether it's a mag, So if you have a quiet, it may only be around 700 feet per second. If you have a long, it may be around 1,100 feet per second. So what does that mean? That means from the time you shoot it till the time it reaches its destination, it's traveling somewhere between 700 to 1,100 feet per second. And what causes it to go out there? Well, it's the powder that's in there. And then you have a firing pin that hits that, it ignites it, and it sends the bullet flying through the air. So now think of, in terms of like a .30-06 bullet. It's a lot bigger. And there's different calibers that you can have, or grains. But if you just have like a 150 grain .30-06 bullet, and you have more gunpowder in there, and you have a primer and a firing pin hits that, it's going to go somewhere around 3,000 feet per second, almost 3 times what a .22 bullet would go. So, which is going to get to this destination faster, a .22 or a .30-06? A .30-06. And you may be wondering, what does that have to do with matter and energy? Well, let me put it this way. You have the time it takes to get from point A to point B. That is time. And then what's in between those two? Space. And it's the matter or the energy that is ignited that forces it to travel at a certain speed. And guess where all those components came from? Right here in Genesis 1:1. You have time, you have space, and you have the energy or the matter. And so when we want to try to think this through, and that's just one example because I have a daughter that's a chemist, and she would tell you that represents chemistry because you make a bullet, you make the casing, and you have the powder and the primer and so on. My son, who's a physicist, he likes physics, so he would say that's all about physics. So I like to get them in a little debate from time to time. But what would you say? Is it chemistry or is it physics?
Both.
Exactly, it's both. And that's what I try to compel them to understand. But that's the way everything begins. The tables and chairs that we sit in all come from this matter or energy. Everything that we have comes from what God has created in the very beginning. So He creates all this, time, space, and energy, the beginning and the heavens and the earth. But He says it was all void, it was without form, it was darkness over the face of the deep. And here's where we at least know the triune because we have God and the Spirit. And when we get in the New Testament, we find out that Jesus made all things and through Him all things were made. So we know the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were all there. So here's the big challenge that we have with some of the people about creation. How long was it between verse 2 and verse 3? It doesn't tell us. And so all of a sudden people just have all kind of theories that come in there. And I would tend to believe that verse 1 and 2 is really all part of day 1. But there's some people that teach what they call the gap theory, where they would say there was billions of years in between verse 2 and verse 3. And because it doesn't necessarily say one way or the other, I understand why people would think that. But if you ask me, I'm going to say when He began to create the heavens and the earth and He created time, that's all part of the first day. And so on question number 2, write down what He created on each day. I'm just going to sort of go through these and you can highlight these or underline them on your text there. But on day 1, there's light. Let there be light. And at the end of that was, in verse 5, was the first day. Then on day 2, He said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. So apparently the whole place seemed to be some kind of a mist or a water. And He decided He wanted to separate that. So you've got heaven above and then somewhere down low. And so He called that the expanse of heaven. And that was the second day. On the third day, He created dry land and the seas. And then He began, and says in verse 11, to create vegetation and plants and fruit trees. It's interesting how specific this is. At the end of verse 7, after he had created day 2 things, it says, and it was so. And then in verse 11, at the end of it, after he created all this vegetation and the dry land and the seas, and it was so. But he adds something at the end of verse 12. And God saw that it was good. We need to remember that. Day 4, let the lights in the expanse of the heavens separate from the day and the night. So all of a sudden, we start having signs for the seasons and for the days and for the years. And so somehow we begin to have something that would tell us, here's a day, here's a week, here's a month, here's a year. And the lesser light was to rule at night, which would be the moon and stars. And sometimes we can see them during the daytime, the stars. But what ruled during the day? The sun. And at the end of verse 18, and God saw that it was good. And then day 5, he decides to do a little bit more. Let the water swarm with the swarms of living creatures. Let the birds fly above the earth and across the expanse of the heavens. And he created the great sea creatures. Wondering what those were. Maybe, and it says, in every living creature that moves. And then he's at the end of verse 21, and God saw that it was good. And then he told all creation, be fruitful and multiply and fulfill all the world. And then day 6, God said, let's bring forth living creatures. Well, he'd already done some of those, but now it seems like a different kind. There's livestock, and there's creeping things, and there's beasts of the earth. And they all produced after their kind. And in the end of verse 25, and God saw that it was good. And then he did something that was very interesting. In verse 26, God said, well, who did he say this to? Did he say it to all the animals and livestock that he created? Or is he maybe referencing his Son and the Holy Spirit? He says, let us make man in our image. Well, I don't think he's making us like some of the other animals, although there's people that try to say we come from apes or whatever. I don't think any of my family came from apes, but he made man. And in verse 27, it says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. In case you didn't get enough created them in there, says that over and over. And then God, after he created man and woman, who is Adam and Eve, says God blessed them and then told them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, and over every other living thing that moves on the earth. And then in verse 31, in verse 30, he actually says, and it was so. But at the end of verse, or partway through verse 31, he says, it was very good. And there was evening and morning the 6th day. And then chapter 1 doesn't tell us this, but chapter 2 does. He tells us that God rested. Chapter 1 is sort of an overview of Genesis. Genesis chapter 2 gets into some of the specifics of what happened in particular. So we did part of your homework for you there in lesson 2, and I hope that you will look at this chapter and begin to look at that, because when we think about Christianity, it's very important for us to understand what happened from the very beginning. And the reason was because back in 1925, the Scopes monkey trial, as it was called, was based on the fact that schools, this one in particular was in Tennessee, was not to teach evolution. But a teacher began to teach it, and so the person was under arrest, and it went before a judge to determine whether or not evolution should or should not be taught in schools. And it's amazing to me that I have family from Tennessee, and it's amazing that there are some schools in the South, especially Mississippi, for a long time, taught evolution from the standpoint that they believed, and this was a state school, 2 state schools in Mississippi, they particularly taught that black people were the gap between apes and man. And I remember sitting several years ago with a guy who believed that Cain's mark, that he had, was that he was black. And I asked him, by what verse of Genesis chapter 4 do you read that? Because that would be just as absurd as me saying maybe the mark was that he was an albino. We don't know. And so the Scopes monkey trial was something that was really not based on science at all. It was somebody who did not believe Christianity and did not want to teach the biblical truth. And so this is where we sort of begin with whether Christianity can survive in a scientific age, because what people who do not want to accept the Bible would say, don't use Genesis 1 or 2. Let's start someplace else. Well, then it's up for grabs. So somewhere we have to have the foundation. And so if we go outside the Bible, does archaeology support the Bible? We've studied a little bit in our lessons about how archaeology gives us just insurmountable details about the Bible. And so what we have to do is when most archaeologists, they will look at the Bible and see what the Bible says about something, and then they will try to go and find out if it's proves to be true from the archaeology. And so one of the things that was told for many, many years was that the Hittite nation didn't exist. Do you remember a guy by the name of David? And he had an affair with a lady named Bathsheba, whose husband was Uriah the Hittite. And so they would try to tell you that none of that is true because they hadn't found any reference to prove any of that. And of course, this goes way back to Genesis 15. And so in the 1870s, they discovered references to the Hittites in ancient Mesopotamian records. And so now whole entire Hittite cities have been found that support what the Bible has told us for millenniums. And so archaeology has supported the Bible. And if you want to learn more about that, Nelson Gluck has some things that you can read about that. Or he actually said that there had been no discovery of archaeology that had never discredited a biblical reference. And so we sort of need to hold on to that, because every time they do archaeological digs, it supports what the Bible has said. Even here a couple weeks ago, they found underneath some of the garden tomb places where there had been like a garden to support that Jesus actually did go to a garden of Gethsemane the night before he was crucified. So the next part is the Bible and textual criticism. So this is really an important part because this is my Greek New Testament. And so I put a couple cards here because there's like a dictionary in the back, and then there's other stuff in the front. But this right here is all the Greek New Testament. And so people will try to tell you that there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of mistakes in here, and it cannot be trusted. So the question is, what mistakes are made? Well, if I stood up here and told you, because if I was a scribe and I was dictating to you the text, and I would say, in the beginning was the Word. Anybody know where that's from? John 1:1. But let's say that Bill over here, instead of say in the beginning, maybe he put down beginnings and put an S on it. And then Bill's copy goes out and other people take Bill's copy, and all the rest of us did it right, but Bill got it wrong. So Bill's copy goes out and somebody takes it and they quote it, and all the people that hears and is writing on the manuscripts for Bill's copy, guess what they will do? Well, make the same error. Because Bill said beginnings instead of beginning, and so all of a sudden you have hundreds of other additional copies. And so what the critics would tell you is if there was 100 people that read Bill's, translated from Bill's copy, they would tell you that there's 101 errors or discrepancies between what all you wrote and versus what he wrote. And so they're not like thousands upon thousands upon thousands of discrepancies. It's one discrepancy, one misspelled word, and it may or may not make a lot of difference in what we would understand. So on the Greek New Testament, 1/2 of one page, 1/2 of one page would be all the discrepancies that you would find in the Greek New Testament from all the different manuscripts. And so we're not dealing with thousands upon thousands upon thousands of mistakes. And the way we know that, this little book is called a Textus, it's a Textus Receptus. It's a textual commentary on the Greek New Testament. So what it does goes from Matthew to Revelation, and it will go to certain words in certain text, and it will tell you that here's why this word should be what it is. And so they would look at beginning or beginnings, and they would say, based upon the majority of the text and the sentence structure and the context of what we're reading, Bill's copy was wrong. And it should have said beginning. And so that's what this does. And by the time you go through that and look at these different half page of what they're calling errors, all of a sudden you find out there's nothing that we don't know about our Bible that we have in 2025 that the first century Christians didn't have available to them. And so the Bible and textual criticism is very important because it helps us to understand that, for instance, the fragments that we have are very specific. And sometimes people will read Homer's Iliad, and we only have 643 copies of that. And guess how old the closest copy to Homer's Iliad is. It's 1,000 years later. And people will have no problem believing that that 1,000-year post-writing is exactly what Homer wrote, and yet when we have copies that are around 100 years after it was written, they're like, oh, you can't trust those. So the Bible and textual criticism is very important. And this book is the one that he references by Bruce Metzger, who has done just an incredible amount of work showing that the accuracy is like 99.5% accurate. In the Old Testament, and I think we talked about this just briefly at one of our other lessons, but archaeologists before 1947 criticized a lot of the Old Testament. In fact, they would tell you that Isaiah was written in 3 different time periods by 3 different people, and they would lead you to believe that maybe the first 39 chapters Isaiah wrote, but then the rest of that was written by a couple different guys. And then the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls happened. And we found that the oldest copy that we have of the book of Isaiah, when those were found, was about 100 BC. So it was written 100 years before Christ. So now those same, I call them liberal theologians, they have a problem. Because they've been saying Isaiah was written 3 different time periods in order to disprove that Jesus lived and fulfilled the prophecies. Well, now that we have a copy that was at least 100 years before Christ, that's just 600 years or so after Isaiah. And now we have copies that we have found, because almost the whole scroll of Isaiah was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if you ever get a chance to go someplace where they show that, I mean, if we were to take that scroll and put it around this whole room that we're in, there's just a few pieces that have been tattered and, like a couple pieces of letters that's off here, or a few that's off here. But when you put it together and you begin to translate it, you can tell that it's exactly what we have today. And now they found some of those manuscripts that they believe are dated closer to 500 BC. And so some of them are dated even farther than the ones that the Dead Sea Scrolls found, because they found other caves with other fragments. They were in like clay jars, and that's how they discovered them, because a little boy whose sheep got in there, remember seeing those when we were over there. I'm not sure how they got in there, but a sheep got in one of those and wouldn't come out, and so he throws a rock in there and heard something break. So how in the world he shimmied down into those caves, but he did, and brings out some scrolls and sold it to a guy for some food, and that guy noticed that it was maybe something important, and he sold it to somebody else, and then somebody else got their hands on it and realized, hey, this is a very ancient document, and now it's worth a lot of money. So thanks to the work of these textual critics who looked at the different manuscripts that we have available to us, and they could date things and they could tell us what we have is true. And if you can believe the other writings of the other prophets that we have, the Old Testament books that they found in these caves, and you can believe that those are true, now all of a sudden you can trust that the Bible that we have is really what it says it is. However, not all people will agree with that, because there's some people who you could tell them these tables are white, and somebody's going to say, no, they're black. They just refuse to believe certain truths. And some of that is sociology, psychology, astronomy, biology, anthropology, a lot of those people have decided that none of the Bible is true. They've never researched it. They've never studied whether it's true or not. They've simply believed it's false because guess what would happen if they believed that it was true? They would have to change their life or admit that they're not going to heaven because they're living a life of sin. So that gets us down to some of the things we've studied, faith versus fact. It's one thing for us to have faith in something. It's something else to know that it is a matter of fact. And when we study all the pieces and put all the pieces together, it's really hard for us to believe that what we have as far as the Bible is not true. In fact, it would take more faith for me to believe in evolution than it would believe that God simply spoke and things were created. Because if at some point you have to go back, where did stuff come from? I mean, you just can't get something from nothing. And Genesis 1:1 tells us where everything came from. Even diamonds. As a chunk of coal until it's been around for thousands of years, and then it becomes a precious diamond. And I really thought Joni would like her engagement ring to be a chunk of coal, but for some reason she didn't want to raid around.
There you go.
So I had to do what women like, and that is get a diamond. Evolution is such a interesting part of even our culture today because so many people teach it as fact. And it can never, ever be factual. If it indeed happened that way, that would be one thing. But because we can't go back and test it, just like creation, we can't go back and test that because it's not like God's going to start, well, I mean, I guess He could, but it's not like God's going to say, let there be light, let there be dry land, and let there be heavens, let there be fish and birds. He's not going to do that again because He's already done it. And so we have to accept that by faith. And evolution, if it were true, could only be accepted by faith, that this is how it started. And so that puts it in a complete different context because the hypothesis is you can go back and test it. And with creation and all humanity, everything that we know cannot be done over again. So that puts it not in as a theory. Well, it could be a theory. And I would like to share that evolution and creation are not the only theories out there. These are just the two we're sort of dealing with here. Because a lot of the other ones fall short in their teachings and they're not as well known as what creation and evolution is. Some people would say that if there are mutations, that's a sign of evolution. But go back to Genesis 1, and God said to every kind, reproduce after your kind. In other words, a dog does not reproduce and become a cat. Okay? Now, if a cat is in the species of tigers and lions and leopards and stuff, you may have different kinds of cats, big cats and small cats, whatever, but they're still after their kind. And then some people say, well, if you have a genetic disorder and that's inherited by your kids, then that's a sign that can be mutations, because you have all these genes and all this genetic coding that we have, and some things are passed down by moms, some things are passed down by dads, and we have different kinds of blood types because there's different kinds of people. If you really look at our skin colors, there is not necessarily true black and white. There's different shades of one color, and some of them are darker than others. There's one human race. So all of mankind is one kind. And cows, there may be different breeds of cows. And for me, the only good cow is a black cow, because we deal in black Angus, so we don't want any of those other cows around. But cows don't produce leopards or tigers. They don't produce horses, so each kind reproduces after its kind. And sometimes mutations can be caused from different things that we put into place. For instance, radiation or different chemicals. That maybe if somebody puts something in your water and you drink it, and it's going to cause certain things to happen to you. And if you have a child and you've got some stuff going on with you because of chemicals or radiation, all of a sudden that may be passed down to your kids, but you're not producing a dog or a cat. You're still producing a human being that just has some genetic issues. And so that's an important part for us to consider. There are some things that, there are some animals that they seem to change colors based on their surroundings. And we see this sometimes in fish. If they're down in the bottom of the water and mud, they seem to adapt to that color. If they're up closer towards the top, they may look like they're a different color. Butterflies are the same way. There's been some butterflies that after a volcano explosion, because the flowers had a lot of black soot on it, sometimes all of a sudden you would start finding some butterflies would start to adapting to that color, because they're really more transparent, but it looks like they're black if they're on something that's black. If they're on something that's green, they look more like they're green. And so they can adapt to that, but they're not changing their kind. It's still a butterfly. When trying to talk about some of these mutations, the first explanation has two problems. First, most mutations are harmful and not helpful. So if we try to go in there and genetically modify something, such as you take wheat or you take corn and beans and you try to genetically modify it and alter what it's supposed to be, what happens? Well, it changes what their functions are. For instance, today, when I was growing up, the phrase "don't sell your seed wheat" meant you would cut your wheat and sell 90% of it, but 10% of it you would hold back and you would have it so you could reseed it. That doesn't happen today because they've altered it genetically. And so today 100% of it is taken to the market and you have to buy all your new seed wheat. Or we have things that's called gluten intolerance because we've genetically modified wheat or corn or other things to where it's not like it was 50 or 75 years ago, where you could go out and eat it and it would be fine. Now people have allergies to that type of stuff. That's not because the corn has changed per se. It's because we have intentionally changed it. And so once people really understand that it's not just changing on its own, but we're doing the changing of that, modifying it, that makes a big difference. And secondly, there's no evidence that mutation can produce a new kind of an orgasm. In other words, if you have corn, and even though you alter it and make it where you can't plant it or replant part of it for seed, does it change it from being corn? No, it's still corn. It's just been genetically modified. And so the mutations do not necessarily, it's not like corn all of a sudden becomes beans or beans become wheat. No, you still have its own kind, and that's what God said in Genesis 1, that the seeds of the field, the trees, would bear fruit after its kind. There's not been one day that you could go to a pear tree and find an orange. It doesn't happen. Now you can graft something into the tree, and those branches would produce something different. But the tree roots itself, the main tree, if you leave it alone and don't try to intentionally graft something into it, it's not going to change from being a pear tree to an orange tree. And so that's what the arguments are, because they would try to tell you, yes, one of these days, these pear trees are all going to be orange trees, and it just doesn't happen. So then the science and the gaps, the God gaps, which I alluded to at the beginning between Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, and verse 3. There are sometimes people try to fill these gaps with billions of years, because it's hard, I guess, for some people to understand that when God says, let there be, and He creates it, how old was Adam when He created him? Okay, we don't know. But do you think he was a baby? You think he was a new infant? No. He was probably a man, I don't know, maybe in his 20s or something. And He created Eve from Adam. And then maybe they were in their 20s or something. I don't know how old they were. I mean, when you live to be 900 and some years old, they could have been 100. But when He created the mountains, He didn't just create them as if they were infants. He created them in all their beauty and all the things that we see. And then there's other parts of what some people would say, like for instance the Grand Canyon. People would say, oh, it took millions and millions and millions of years for that to develop. And yet we had the very same thing from different earthquakes and different things that have happened. And so when you go back and study the geology of that, all of a sudden you realize the sediment and things, the layers of the Grand Canyons complement what happened in Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 with the flood. So it didn't take necessarily millions of years, but a lot of Christians, strong Christians, people who I believe a lot of the other stuff they say, believe that there was billions of years of gap in between there. And that's their argument, because they can't comprehend that God could create something that already looks like what we see it as today. So some people would try to say, they call it the Big Bang Theory. They would try to say that there was this big explosion that caused everything to happen and start. And then they say that it took billions of years for that to happen, to get to us. And when you start looking at Genesis day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, just take the tree for instance. How does a tree survive outside of its roots? I'm talking about in the space. What does it take to survive?
Water and soil.
That's below the ground.
Sun.
Okay, the sun, but carbon monoxide. Trees breathe in carbon monoxide. What do we breathe in? Oxygen. What do we exhale? Carbon monoxide. And so a tree breathes in carbon monoxide, it gives off oxygen. So how long did it take, if it would have taken billions of years for trees to survive without oxygen? I mean, we could say God created oxygen there, but there's this natural giving and taking of all creation. And so we need to understand that going back to Genesis 1:1, everything that a tree needed to survive, God created from the very beginning. Because a tree, to grow, to be strong, they say if you want to get a good oak, to cut down so you can make like an axe handle, you don't go down to the valley. You go up to the top of the hill where it's been tested and tried by the wind and it's stronger. And that takes time. And it takes some space. And it takes some matter or energy for that to happen. And so the Big Bang Theory just sort of really falls apart because nothing could survive through the Big Bang Theory because it rests on millions and millions of years. So as we close this study, here's what we need to understand. I like what Richard Kafarnas summed up this whole study with. We need never fear that science will render Christianity obsolete. Our faith will endure not because it is immune to scientific investigations, but because the facts are on our side. Our worldview, our biblical worldview, is superior to any other. Our hope is fixed on the true and living God, and our faith is built on the evidence of history, and that's why we believe. Because from lesson 1 to lesson 13 of this study, chapter by chapter, it shows us why what we believe, why it's true. And you can share this with other people because it's reliable. So in our closing moments tonight, questions that you might have about our study. Or comments or anything. Yes?
I'm thinking of something that Ken Ham will tell evolutionists. Were you there?
Yeah. Yeah, Ken Ham would tell in some of his debates with evolutionists, he would ask them, were you there? Because if they weren't there billions of years ago, they can't tell you that the Big Bang happened. It puts it in the realm of faith, that they have to trust that by faith. Yes, Bill?
At the beginning, you asked the question, is Christianity and science compatible? Well, Sir Isaac Newton, Johannes Kepler, James Clerk Maxwell, and Michael Faraday would say yes.
Yes, throughout the ages, a lot of strong scientists that discovered and brought to us many things were strong Christians, and they believed the Bible to be true and accurate. And so it's only been in the last couple hundred years that scientists have begun to move away from biblical truth to naturalistic truth. But most scientists, even today, that have studied and researched will tell you that there's absolutely no way that you can believe things just happen. If you just simply took our eye and studied the intricacy of our eye and all the things that happens to make us see, you have to believe that there was a designer that created that. It didn't just happen out of an explosion somewhere. Thank you for staying with us for these 13 weeks, and God bless you all.